as we try to talk our way through these introductory matters that you can see there on the screen. The first introductory matter has to do with authorship. In other words, who wrote 1 Peter. And when you look at 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, the Apostle Peter's name is mentioned there. And when you look at chapter 5, verse 1, he says, "Therefore I exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ." So Peter would fit that description because he was an eyewitness to the earthly ministry of Jesus Christ. A lot of the things that you read about in the Gospels related to Peter show up in this book. For example, this book places an emphasis on feeding God's flock, chapter 5, verse 2. And that's what Jesus told Peter to do. If you love me, feed my sheep. If you love me, care for my sheep. John 21, 15 through 17. This book, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5, makes an emphasis on clothing oneself. You'll see that there in verse 5 of chapter 5. That certainly fits the description of Jesus, who clothed himself in humility as well as he got down on his hands and knees in Peter's presence there in the upper room in John 13, verses 13 through 17, and began to wash the feet of the disciples. This book places an emphasis on girding oneself. That kind of language is used. 1 Peter 5, verse 5, that sort of fits with what Peter saw Jesus do back in the upper room, where he took a towel and girded himself. This book will quote Psalm 118, verse 22. The stone which the builders rejected has become the capstone. That happens there in chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. And Jesus, in Peter's presence, quoted that particular psalm to the Pharisees in Matthew 21, verse 42. So the things that happened between Jesus and Peter in the Gospels, there seem to be some allusions to those occurrences here in 1 Peter. Beyond that, a lot of the things that Peter says in the book of Acts show up in this particular book. For example, Acts 10, verse 34 indicates that God is not a respecter of persons. Peter there speaking. That concept shows up in 1 Peter 1, verse 17. Acts 2, verses 32 through 36, Peter speaking there speaks of the resurrection, ascension, and glorification of Jesus. That's what shows up here in 1 Peter 1, verse 21. Acts 4, verses 10 and 11 talks about Jesus rejected as the cornerstone. Well, that concept shows up right here in 1 Peter 2, 7 and 8. Acts 2, verse 23, Peter made the point that Christ's death was preordained. Well, that concept shows up right here in 1 Peter 1, verse 20. Acts 10:42 indicates that God will judge the living and the dead. Peter speaking there. That concept shows up in 1 Peter 4, verse 5. And then the idea that the cross is made of wood. There's a particular Greek word that Peter uses in the book of Acts to describe the cross of wood. Acts 5, verse 30, Acts 10, verse 2, and verse 9. Well, that idea and word shows up in 1 Peter 2:24. So when you compare the life of Peter as given in the Gospels to this book, the life of Peter is narrated in the book of Acts, and you compare it to this book, the similarities are there. So that's more evidence internally that Peter actually wrote this epistle. The book has within it, 1 Peter, 34 commands, and that would make sense if Peter is the author, because he is an apostle and is in a position to give commands to God's people. And then when you go outside the Bible and you look at external evidence, and what I've just developed here are just various strands of internal evidence, but you go outside the Bible and you look at the external evidence, there's very strong external evidence in the writings of the church fathers, etc., that Peter is actually the writer of this epistle called 1 Peter. Now, I will make you aware of one thing. When you look at 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 12, it's evident that Peter used what's called an amanuensis to compose this book. An amanuensis is a scribe. the word, you'll recognize the word manual in the word amanuensis. And when you look at verse 12 of 1 Peter 5, it says, through Silvanus, our faithful brother, for I so regard him, I have written to you briefly, exhorting and testifying that this is the true grace of God, stand firm in it. For example, Tertius was Paul's, what we can tell, his scribe in the book of Romans. You see Tertius's name mentioned in Romans 16. So Peter is the primary author, but there was a scribe that put his thoughts together for him. And I bring that up because when we get to 2 Peter, there's a big debate on whether Peter wrote 2 Peter. And they try to draw all these sort of contradictions in the writing styles between 1 Peter and 2 Peter, but those are all resolved if you understand that Peter used an amanuensis or a scribe in 1 Peter named Silvanus. So who wrote this particular book? Ultimately, the authorship is Peter.